Hello and welcome to all the people watching on this video chat. My name is Melvin Chen. I'm the Deputy Dean of the School of Music, and I'm also on the piano faculty. With me is Professor Boris Berman, who's the professor of piano, and he's also the coordinator of the piano department. And before we start answering questions, I'd like him to kind of talk a little bit about the piano department and the Yale School of Music in general.
Okay, well, welcome, hello to everybody who is watching us. The piano department is something I am actually very proud of. What I particularly like in the department, that all faculty members work in very close cooperation with one another. We very frequently send our students to play for another teacher. When we give master classes, students never play for their own teacher, but always for another teacher. And so students in course of their tenure at Yale, they will have an opportunity of interacting, of working with various faculty members. In general, I think this is a very friendly department, and I think the friendly relations that exist between the faculty, among the faculty, spill over to students, and I think students are genuinely friendly and supportive of each other. In general, we have wonderful students coming from all distant corners of the world, and it is actually a pleasure to work with our students.
I also want to remind you that if you guys watching have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat window, and I have a computer here, so please answer any questions. I'll ask of you, can you talk a little bit about the facilities available to the pianists?
Yeah, facilities. Well, right now you see us sitting in my studio. It is where I teach, and we have here two very good Steinway Bs. We are all Steinway school, all pianos we have both in practice rooms and in studios are Steinways. I also should say that in addition to practice rooms, and in my experience, we have a much better situation with practice rooms than in many schools I have been visiting. But our students also have an opportunity to practice in the studios of their respective teachers. So it both adds up to availabilities, and these are our best pianos that we have and put in the disposal of our students.
And how about the performance spaces?
The performance spaces, we have fantastic hall where most of our concerts, basically all chamber concerts, all recitals are taking place. The Sprague Hall, which is about 780 seats. It's a hall with a wonderful acoustics. It's a hall where the students also can record, and the recordings are made there. We have another hall which is much bigger, Woolsey Hall, which is the place where our orchestra, our Philharmonia Orchestra performs, and where some university big events are taking place. We have a smaller recital hall, Sadler Hall, which is also available for students. And also there are numerous places on campus where one can perform, and we encourage our students to perform not only the recitals which they are required to give, but also use the opportunity of performing, because that's what bring the students here in the first place.
And I'll just add that the Sprague Hall has two very nice concert grand pianos. One's a German Steinway and also a New York Steinway.
Yes.
There are many performance opportunities on campus, and can you talk about some of the off-campus performance opportunities that the pianists have? I know you've taken students,
Yes,
other places.
we try to make our best students known outside of New Haven. We have this series of concerts in the Steinway Hall in Manhattan. We usually have 2 concerts, and the next one, if I'm not mistaken, is on March 27th, where our students perform, and it is open to the public. We had our students performing in Yale Hall. We had our students performing in China, and there are some plans to enable our students perform both outside of the campus and to record professionally. And these plans are being finalized as we speak.
One of the great things here is that there are many guest artists visiting on campus, both playing recitals and giving master classes. Out of the pianists, there's a special Horowitz series. Can you just mention some of the people who have come to teach and play over the few years?
Well, we are now planning the next season, and I can say that in the next season, Richard Good will come and teach. Peter Serkin will come and teach. Niklas Sivelov from Copenhagen will come. This season there were Leon Fleischer, Pascal Roger, who else I forgot about. But actually, in course of the years, we had Emmanuel Ax, Yefim Bronfman, Mari Peraya, Radu Lupu, Misha Dichter, Gary Colson. We had wonderful guests, and it seems that this is a series which is going very strong. It's very popular in the university. Usually, guests are coming to play a recital and give the master classes, but there are also guests who are coming just for master classes. And next year it will be Niklas Siverov, I mentioned, Ronan Hora from Guildhall College in London, and some other people. For me, one of the great things about the school is its small size, as you mentioned, but also where the School of Music is within a larger university. Are there, I know in Piano Seminar, there are particular resources of the university that you take advantage of. Maybe you could mention some of those. Yes, the Piano Seminar, which is the required course for all pianists, we choose the topic for each semester, and students are taking turn making oral presentations and also playing. And this semester, for instance, the overall theme is Bach and his influence on different composers from the 18th century through the 20th century. The previous semester we talked about Chopin and Debussy, and we took advantage of a wonderful collection of musical instruments we have on campus with old pianos of the time of Chopin, of the time of Debussy, and students were able to play them. We heard the lecture. And then when we talked about Debussy, who was so connected with the visual arts of his time, one of the sessions took place in the Yale Art Gallery, and I think it was, for me, it was absolutely thrilling to have students discuss the art of this time standing a few inches away from the originals of Monet and Cézanne and Van Gogh and Gauguin. This is an opportunity which cannot be beaten. It is an unbelievable experience.
One thing I'd like to mention, obviously, we have fabulous resources available, both musical and extra musical. There are other resources at the school that are available that is not usually printed in the brochures. One is, for example, that students have availability to use a fund to travel to competitions, and many of our students have won prizes in competitions, and so that's something that the student can take advantage of. Since the people watching are about to come and have an audition, maybe you could talk about what they should expect, what the audition will be like.
Yes, since you mentioned the funds available for competitions, I should say that there are also annual prizes which school gives to outstanding students. I should probably mention that for those who are concerned about making it in New Haven, there are opportunities, there are possibilities to earn money by teaching, by accompanying, and also by doing all kind of jobs which are available on campus.
Good. And what would you say to the applicants about the live audition, what to
about
expect?
About the live audition. Well, I think you all got a note from me. Basically, the audition will be about 15 minutes, and we start with the piece of your choice. We ask you to bring the typed copies of your program, please, of the list of the works, not of the works themselves, because in the past we had people bringing the photocopies of the scores, 5 copies of the full scores. We do not need it. We need only the list of the works. You will be stopped, and the judges, the jurors, will ask for something else. You may be asked some questions about music history, music theory. You may be asked to sight read. So keep this in mind. Do not be flustered. It's a normal process.
So now you'll we'll answer some of your questions. So if you have questions, please go ahead and submit them. The first question I'll ask you, Professor Berman. Somebody asks, how many candidates have been invited for live auditions this year, and out of those, how many will be admitted?
Okay, this year we received 267 applications. Out of this, we selected 78 people to come to play live. So if you have been selected, congratulations, you had a very competitive environment already in the selection, in the pre-selection process, I should say. We are seeking to choose out of 78 people who will come here. We are seeking to choose 15 pianists altogether in different programs altogether. And of course, will make our decision based on your performance. This will be the major component. However, there are certain requirements which the students must meet in order to be admitted. For foreign students, it's the TOEFL. You all know the minimum score required, and we cannot issue the admittance letter to you before this requirement will be met. Your transcripts, your recommendations should be provided. You all know what you need to do. And of course, for those of you who apply for the DMA program, which has been revamped this year, you need to pass the written examination. Without this, we cannot accept you to the DMA program. And, well, let me tell you, it is a rather demanding exam.
Good. Now, there's another question which I guess I'll answer. You know, the question is where do students live usually? I think that there are a variety of places where the students live. You know, a bunch of them will rent an apartment off campus within walking distance or on the shuttle route, and they'll rent an apartment and cook their meals and all that. Other people choose to stay in graduate student housing, which are graduate dorms, and those are also close to campus, and you can live there. So there is a variety of options within walking distance or close to public transportation that they can live nicely and still get to school in an easy manner.
Yes, for those of you who want to drive, you can of course live a little bit farther away, but we insist on our students being in residence in New Haven. It is simply, it does not work when somebody tries to commute from New York or from Boston or from Harvard. You are missing a lot this way, a lot of classes, a lot of concerts, a lot of rehearsals. And besides, in the weather like we have today, I think everybody is very happy to be as close to the campus as possible.
Good. There's another question about those history and sight reading questions. Those will take place usually after the playing, but they'll be in the 15 minutes. They're not additional to the 15 minutes. And and some of we may be, if we're running low on time, we may not do the sight reading.
Yes.
So it depends on how the day is running. Another question: when will I know if I'm admitted?
Well, you will receive the letter of admission not later than April 1st, probably a little bit earlier than that. Okay,
and there's a question about teacher assignments. How does that work?
Well, I think we have an excellent record of trying to satisfy all requests for teachers, subject to two things. One is available space in the studios. We all have our load, and in every studio the situation is different. This year one studio has a lot of openings because many people graduate. Another studio may have no opening. So this is what will determine. Another thing will determine it. You have to respect this, that the teacher also may have preferences. and the teacher also may prefer one student over another.
So I think generally it's safe to say that we will know your preference of teacher, and in certain cases it may not be possible.
Yes, but usually we try to satisfy the requests. And let me tell you, we will look at these requests after you have played. So do not try to second guess us, saying if I put this name I have more chances or not. No, it is. It doesn't work this way. We look into these requests only after you have played and have made your impression.
I mean, I'll also say that since basically the students will have the opportunity to play for all the piano faculty. Just because you're assigned to one teacher doesn't mean you might not have lessons with the rest of the other faculty as well.
You're absolutely right. Besides, there is another aspect of this, and this is chamber music. We all coach chamber groups, and usually, sometimes I end up coaching the group which has my student. On other occasions, I have pianists from a different studio, and so this is another way for us to collaborate.
Good. Another question is, how do you view certificate students, and how is their experience different from other degree students?
Well, I had a wonderful experience with some of my certificate students. So I am very fond, actually, of this program. You have read the description of a certificate program. There are certain things which you are not required to do what the master's students require. However, since we assume that somewhere along the line you would like your certificate to be converted to the master's, we recommend, and basically we try to make sure that you satisfy all requirements of the master degree. You stay here for 3 years and not for 2 years as master students. However, and then those of you who want academic career being boosted, they go to another institution for getting their bachelor's degree. After completing the bachelor's degree, the students may petition to have their certificate converted into the master's. So this is basically a degree when you earn your de facto master's before you earn your bachelor's. Since you're staying here for 3 years, you have on your transcript more courses than is needed for masters, and very often your undergraduate institution will accept this. So in fact, very often our certificate students went to the undergraduate institution and stayed there not the required 4 years, but 3 years, somebody even 2.5 or something. Mm-hmm. So in fact, this extra year has been compensated, but this is of course upon discretion of the undergraduate institution. But the things which you need to know, that the certificate student is fully integrated in the life and the work of the piano department. There are no courses just for the certificate students. You are taking courses together with all other students.
I mean, it's basically a master's program at, at the level of the master's, and basically the only difference is it takes 3 years instead of 2 years, but all the, all the other stuff is the same. I think it's a good opportunity for someone younger who's a little more mature to be in a community of older and more mature students.
Yes, and another thing, because the question is often asked, why do we need this? It gives us an opportunity, if we as faculty meet a student or hear the student who is ready to study here, rather than waiting 4 years or 3 years if the student is already studying in an undergraduate program, it gives us an opportunity to welcome this person to the graduate program at Yale right away.
Okay. One question is about TOEFL, and I think Professor Berman said it quite clearly that we have a TOEFL score requirement of at least 86, and before you can be admitted to the School of Music, you must demonstrate a score at 86 or above. So if you don't have that by April 1st, we cannot admit you to the program, and we'll need to go to the next person on the list. So I just want to be quite clear about that. And another question is, and I don't know how you want to answer this, how many students are accepted into each degree program, into master's, DMA?
We do not have a quota in each program. There may be a case that there will be not a single artist diploma, not a single doctoral student, not a single certificate. There may be the case when there will be several certificate students. It depends on the pool, but since artist diploma and doctoral degrees are supposed to be the superior and the highest degrees we award, the expectations are much higher for those who apply to these 2 degrees.
Although we basically look at everyone in one big pool.
Yes.
And this, we have a quota on the number of spaces, but not necessarily how they're distributed between degrees.
Exactly.
Okay, and here another question is will there be any opportunity to try the audition pedal? And does it have a middle pedal?
Yes, it does have the middle pedal. Those of you who extensively use the middle pedal know that it usually malfunctions. So do not bank on the middle pedal. But yes, every piano, since we have here Steinway pianos, they all have the middle pedal. Whether you will have an opportunity to try the piano, the answer is no. It was simply with this number of students. But of course, you will be allowed, and actually I think it's not a bad idea at all, to play a few chords and just to get a feel. It's a very prudent thing to do.
And also you'll have the time to warm up on in a different room with a very nice piano, usually in another faculty member's studio.
Yeah, so the chance is that your warm-up room will be this particular room where we're sitting now.
Right. Among others, yes.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Another question, are there any type of international club activity or mentor program? It's my first time living alone. I think that we have many students coming from different countries who are maybe in this situation, and I find that the community of students at the School of Music is very supportive, especially among pianists, very nurturing. I think a lot of the pianists, eat together, they hang out together, they play for each other, and so I think that even though it may be a person's first time living alone, they'll find a welcoming and very warm and generous community when they arrive here.
Besides, do not forget that the School of Music is a small institution, but it's a part of a big university. The university which has a huge international presence. So the chances are that you will find an organization of undergraduate students from your home country, and it will give you an opportunity to socialize with them, to have meals, to discuss the problems which involve and excite all of you. So you certainly will not feel isolated from your home country, and you certainly should not feel isolated from the other members of the student body, either at school or at the university at large.
So this is just a clarification question. If I understood a teacher's assignment do not interfere with acceptance, if my preferred teacher has no space for me, will I still be accepted and have the opportunity to study with a different faculty member who has space and is willing to teach?
Correct. Absolutely correct. So we will basically, if we decide, if we think we want to accept you, we may say, well, we want to extend our invitation. You put Professor so-and-so as your first choice. Unfortunately, he does not have the place, but the person who is your second choice has a place in his studio. But once again, these decisions are made after we decide on whom we want. Write what you want. Do not second guess us, because I had these conversations with people. I said, well, we want you to come. You put this name as number one. I think it will be possible. And then the person says, well, actually, I would be interested in somebody else. I thought that this name will gain me admittance. Do not do it, please. I think, it's always a good policy to say what you really think.
Okay, another question is, can students take classes in other departments of Yale University if they wish? I can answer that. I think, there's certain requirements. If you're admitted as a pianist, you have to do piano seminar, you have to go to the master classes and other things. But aside from that, there's history and theory requirements. And once you have those and you have space in your schedule, you're free to take any other classes in any other part of the university, in Yale College, in the School of Management, as long as you can get into those classes and as long as they don't interfere with any classes you should be taking in the School of Music. So I think there are many, many students in the School of Music who take classes in Yale College. They'll take a literature class or a language class, and that is completely possible and encouraged as well.
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the strongest attractions, the greatest attractions of Yale, that all our students are welcome to attend. I don't think there are any limitations in Yale College. No. In graduate programs, I think you'll agree that it would be prudent that you will not be automatically accepted to the graduate class in molecular biology, but to undergraduate classes in molecular biology, there will be no problem. So as soon as Professor Chen said, as soon as you satisfied the requirements of your degree, the requirements of your department, you are free to take classes outside of the School of Music, and in my experience here, I had people taking courses in philosophy, in Chinese literature, in Russian literature. I remember there was a student from Germany who said, I have always been in conservatories. All my life I wanted to take a class in chemistry. I said, fine, go. And he took, I think, either all 4 semesters or 3 semesters, he took classes in chemistry and was very happy.
Good. I think that's. Oh wait, here we are. If we have one more question. So, but if you have any more questions, please submit them now because I'm reading the last one now. Can graduate students be considered for merit scholarship or assistantship? And in terms of financial aid, all admitted School of Music students have basically the same financial package. They have a full tuition scholarship plus a small living stipend. I think it's $3,800 for all students this year. There are no kind of formal assistantships beyond that, but there's opportunities for teaching undergraduates, as well as other kind of work-study options, working in the music library and other things like that, or accompanying.
Yes, and besides, there are opportunities in the community, in the local churches, in the local community schools. So there are various possibilities.
Okay, one last question, unless there are others. Where will the piano auditions be? Will they be in one of the halls or one of the faculty studios?
It will be in the largest of our faculty studios, the studio of Professor Wei Yang, in the basement of Lee Hall.
Okay, anything else you want to add? I think that's all the questions we have. And there's one more. Okay, there's one last one. Do all students for all programs receive a full tuition scholarship?
That's
yes.
Correct. That's correct. What I want to tell you that we really are very much looking forward to your auditions, that we want you to succeed. We realize that not everybody will succeed, but we wish you lots of success, and we hope that you will do your best, and we hope that we will have a chance to work together with you.
And I'll echo your sentiments. I think, even though it's difficult, everyone should feel that all of us in the piano faculty are wishing for you to do well, even though Professor Berman looks very intimidating. But we hope that we look forward to hearing all of you very soon, and just be relaxed, and all of us are